Welcome to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim. Every Wednesday, Mark and Kim, along with their special guests, will explore thought-provoking topics and ideas that promote creativity, self-help, healing, happiness, and well-being to inspire you on your spiritual journey. Each week, Mark and Kim will discuss different paths to achieving a more spiritual, balanced, happy, and healthy lifestyle. Topics will elevate consciousness and range from metaphysics to the human and social experience, and all things spiritual. Welcome to an inspired community that offers support, encouragement, and new ways of thinking. Mark and Kim are tested, certified, and professional spiritual mediums, metaphysical teachers, healers, and spiritual advisors with their own individual spiritual practices in Seattle, Washington, and Los Angeles, California. You are the inspired and the inspiration.
Don't use time or words carelessly, neither can be retrieved. Today is Wednesday, February 24th, 2016, and this is Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio, the voice of consciousness. I am but just one of the co-hosts, Mark Lanehart, the intuitive prospector. And if you're a spiritual prospector on a spiritual journey looking to explore and discover deeper into your own soul adventure, look me up here in Seattle, Washington, or online at marklanehart.com, or you can internet search The Intuitive Prospector. Spiritual truth, freedom, and knowledge is just a click away. And right down the west coast from me in Encino, California, is my good friend, colleague, and wonderful co-host of Inspired Living Radio, Kim Thalken, founder of Love First. Hi, Kim.
Good afternoon, Mark, and good afternoon to all of our inspired listeners in our community. So good to be here, and thank you for the warm introduction, Mark. I tell you, you always put a smile on my face with your creativity, I should say, and how we brought on the show today. I love it. As Mark said, I am the founder of Love First, where life transformations happen in Encino, California. You can find me at lovefirst.info. And I've got some exciting workshops coming up, one of them with you, Mark. But the first one will be in May 14th.
Oh, I think we lost Kim there. See if we can get her to come back on here. So she was talking about the workshop, and we're going to be
standing.
There we go. Kim, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Now we can. Yeah, it's that old lunar cycle, the old full moon that's out there. So you were talking about the workshop. Keep going.
There we go. Okay, so 14th and 15th on angelic guidance, how to communicate with your guardian angels and spiritual guides, and understanding yourself through angelic eyes. So if you have ever wondered what it'd be like to hear your angels and what they're like to work with, connecting through to the angelic realm, this is going to be a great class for you. So please check my site for more specifics and how to reserve your seat at lovefirst.info. Mark and I also have slated the weekend of July 16th for a fabulous workshop we're going to be doing together in LA. So excited to have Mark come down to LA for this. It's going to be a great weekend. Details will follow soon, and you can find them either on my website or on Mark's, marklanehart.com.
Yeah, looking forward to our first workshop together. That's going to be a lot of fun. So, Kim, how can the inspired listeners interact with the show, or if they want to listen to an encore show, where do they go?
Yes, you can find us on Facebook under Inspired Living Radio. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram under Inspired, the number 4us, and also on Google Plus under Inspired Living with Mark and Kim. And this is where you can not only interact with us, but you can find out about upcoming shows. And you can also send through your questions that way at any time for either Mark or myself or our guests. As you know, we do bring questions live to air, and we love to do that for you. You can also listen to all of our archives on OMTimes Radio, Podbean, SoundCloud. You can also go to marklanehart.com, Vimeo, and YouTube. So there are plenty of ways to keep in touch with us, and we love it when you do.
And what's our positive affirmation to get people on the path of being inspired for this week?
Yes, our inspired affirmation for the month of February is all that I need comes to me at the right time and place in this life.
Awesome. Love it. So this week is a very special week in the fact that I've been looking forward to this show for a long time, and spiritual telepathy is what we're going to be talking about today. So, again, like Kim said, just, thanks for tuning in and being one of our inspired listeners. We always appreciate our listening audience. So if you want to take the next 60 minutes and just snuggle up on the couch, grab a nice cup of tea and sit back and get ready for some great spiritual knowledge is about to come your way. And I just wanted to give a shout out to all of the spiritual prospectors that came out to my workshop on Saturday, Spiritual Borders. We had a great time, learned a lot of information and worked with spirit. So I just wanted to give a shout out to all of the students that came out and participated in the Spiritual Borders workshop. So with that, I want to welcome our special guest, Colleen Mauro, and she is a lifelong interest in the untapped powers that really started to lead Colleen to launch a magazine called Intuition, and it was a magazine for the higher potential of the mind, and she did this back in 1988. Her 30 years of experience in magazine publishing includes work as a publisher, editor, advertising director, and circulation and marketing consultant. The magazine Intuition explored the higher potential of the mind and the many and varied ways of knowing, intuition, inspiration, and telepathy, providing both research and how-to information in easy-to-read form for the general reader. So this is going to be a great show. She fits perfectly in line with Inspired Living Radio because we're all about intuition, inspiration, and telepathy. If you want to learn more about Colleen's work, you can visit her site at spiritualtelepathy.net. And we're going to be talking about her book today. Her book is called Spiritual Telepathy, and it's Ancient Techniques to Access the Wisdoms of Your Soul. So when Kim and I first came across this, we were both very interested on what are the techniques, especially ancient techniques. So they've been around for a long time. Why isn't everybody accessing the wisdom of their soul? So we wanted to bring Colleen on today to give us a more in-depth look behind her book and some of the techniques that she's written about, and get the inspired listeners tapping into their own wisdom. So with that, I would like to welcome Colleen to Inspired Living Radio. Welcome, Colleen.
Welcome, Colleen.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And let's talk about, so 30 years of working in the industry of publishing and editing, so a lot of experience in writing. And didn't I tell you, Colleen, before the show that everything was going to go smoothly, but we do have a lunar cycle going on right now, and we might run into some technical difficulties, and we've already had that. So if we do run into some technical difficulties, we'll do our best to get you back online. But for the time being, tell the inspired listeners a little bit about yourself and the book and your work that you're doing for Spirit.
Well, I have always been very interested in the spiritual world and intuitive studies. And in the late 80s, I was living in San Francisco, and I had worked for a number of alternative magazines, and I suddenly found myself without a job, and I was trying to figure out what to do. I had already worked for all the magazines I liked, so I was a little stumped and not sure what to do next. And I spent my days researching new magazines and worrying about money. It's very expensive to live there, so that's always an issue. And one morning I woke up and I decided that I really needed to take a mental health day, that I would go out and plant some bulbs and spend one worry-free day puttering around in my garden. I was going to give myself a 24-hour break. I remembered it was October, and that's my favorite month in San Francisco. So I was planting bulbs and just puttering around in my garden, and I suddenly had a type of intuitive experience that I'd never had before, a thought. And the thought was the Center for Applied Intuition suddenly flashed through my mind. And I had always accessed intuition through feelings or some kind of body-based sensation. But this was a purely mental experience. The words seemed to have been dropped right into my brain. And I immediately knew that it wasn't my thought, and it certainly made no logical sense. I knew about the center, and I had met the founder, Bill Kautz, but I couldn't imagine why I would go there to look for a magazine job. He had a little 2-room office, and I knew that he ran intuition trainings and sent intuitives out to do business consulting, but I couldn't imagine what I would go there for, except some sort of administrative position, which I knew I didn't want. So it didn't make any sense, but I still kind of mulled it over for a few days. And then I thought, well, what do I have to lose? And I called him up, asked him to send me some information about the center's activities. And a few days later, a large manila envelope arrived, and I dumped it out on my dining room table. And inside were several brochures and a very simple typewritten journal called Applied Psi. And this was the quarterly publication that he sent to the center's 200 members. The journal was about the subjects of intuition and creativity. And when I flipped through the pages, I suddenly had a thought that this could be a real magazine. The name would have to be changed and it would have to be spiffed up quite a bit. But I thought the subjects were so interesting. I knew that they'd appeal to an audience far beyond this tiny little membership. So I called him, made an appointment to speak with him, went over and I pitched him on my idea. And he just lit up and said that he had always dreamed of turning Applied Psi into a real magazine, but the right person had never come along. I went home and I banged out a proposal, came back the next day, and I suddenly found myself launching a new magazine. We called it Intuition, a magazine for the higher potential of the mind. I got 2 issues out for Bill before he closed the center and signed the rights over to me. And I later got a grant and set up an office and hired some staff. And when I think about it now, there are several interesting things about the story. I never would have gotten there through rational process. It never would have occurred to me to look him up if I was looking for a magazine job. I got something better than what I was actually looking for. And I couldn't have seen that in the next decade, there would be a flood of information on the subject of intuition. And the magazine really created a kind of focal point for all the information. So I just followed that guidance I got, and everything just sort of unfolded from there. And I published the magazine until the year 2000. And then I started to study the Ageless Wisdom teachings. And when I came across the subject of spiritual telepathy, I realized that this was the next step in the intuition work that I had done in the 90s, that this was a higher level of intuitive perception.
So, Colleen, with that, for that next step, we're going to take a quick 2-minute break. And when we come back from the break, let's continue with that next step and the intuition and everything that really inspired you to do this magazine. So stay tuned. We're going to be back in 2 minutes. You're listening to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio, the voice of consciousness.
The best of holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Welcome to The Gathering Around My Kitchen Table on Equilarium FM, Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Join my guests as we integrate spirituality into everyday reality with vibrant conversations, inspired interviews, and my latest channeled guidance to inspire and brighten your day. I'm Claire Johnson, and together we'll be raising vibrations across the nations.
Are you seeking answers to life questions? Would you like to connect to a departed loved one? Are you suffering from pain, stress, or anxiety? Kimberly Thalkin is a tested, certified, and professional psychic, spiritual medium, energy healer, hypnotherapist, and the founder of Love First, where life transformations happen. Love First services support, guide, and empower individuals by connecting them to their highest potential to live a healthier, joyful, and meaningful life that's filled with purpose. All services can be done by phone, Skype, or in person in Encino, California. Please visit lovefirst.info. That's LOVEFIRST.info for more information. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Come heal yourself. What is healing? Healing is nothing but connecting with your all-knowing higher self that already has solutions to all your problems and is always there to guide you. Through this show, we help you to connect with that you are and tap into that innate potential you have to transform your life and fly high. Please join me, your host Monica Goyal, every Sunday, 7 p.m. Pacific. Namaste.
Bringing you the best of the conscious minds in the world. OMTimes Radio, your conscious lifestyle on steroids.
And welcome back to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio. Special guest Colleen Mauro talking about spiritual telepathy in the book that she wrote. But before we get into the details of the book, Colleen, you were talking about the magazine Intuition, the story behind how that, even came into reality to become a publication. And you were talking about the next step right before we went to break.
Mm-hmm. I actually, as I said, started to study the Ageless Wisdom teachings. And when I came across the subject of spiritual telepathy, I realized that this was the next step. It's a higher level of intuitive perception. And what we did in the 90s was to teach people to develop and honor their personal intuition. And our personal intuition gives us information about our relationships and our work and other aspects of our day-to-day lives. But it's also possible to connect in an even higher way directly to the soul. And the soul knows our higher purpose. It's our divine partner and our highest and most reliable source of direction and guidance. And the soul is also the portal to even higher worlds. So this really is, as I said, the higher level of intuitive perception. And I think it's the next step and the next big wave that's coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you pointed out that, just kind of when I was reading through the book that, most celebrated creative thinkers, we call them geniuses or visionaries, but we really all have this ability to access these subtle realms that you talk about in the book and really start to get into the bridge of connecting the lower mind to the higher mind. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the potential for everybody that's listening to the show right now having the ability to tap into their own soul consciousness?
Sure. We make contact with the soul through the daily practice of Raja Yoga, or sometimes called creative meditation. And it's a specific type of very active meditation. Many meditation practices focus only on quieting the mind. In this type of meditation, we actively go a step further, and we train our minds to transmit information from the soul to the brain. And the information has to reach the brain to become part of our conscious awareness. And it's in the same way that our homes are wired for telephone and internet connection. This type of meditation allows us to create the threads and cables that link us to the higher worlds. And we do this by projecting our attention upward to the soul day after day. We visualize the soul as a star about 6 inches above our head. And as we do this, we anchor small threads of energy that eventually, thread by thread, form a symbolic bridge between the mind, the brain, and the soul. The bridge is called the Rainbow Bridge, or the Bridge of Light in the Wisdom teachings. It's called the Antakarana in the Hindu text, and it's even in the Bible. It's called the Straight or Narrow Gate in the New Testament. Every spiritual tradition has some sort of concept of a bridge that we build between the physical and spiritual worlds.
Very interesting. I did not know that. And would it also tie into the belief system of the chakra, like the crown chakra, like being a bridge, or is there any ties to that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's ties to different levels of telepathy matching up with our chakras. There's actually 3 types of telepathies. There is the basic telepathy, which is called instinctive telepathy, and we share this kind of telepathy with the animal kingdom. And that type of telepathy utilizes the 3rd chakra, the center of instinct and emotion. The second type of telepathy is mental or mind-to-mind telepathy, and that type of telepathy utilizes the throat center. And the highest is spiritual or soul-to-soul telepathy, and that type of telepathy utilizes the head centers. So that happens actually after we start to open the heart chakra, and our higher chakras become active.
Now, you talked about that there were experiments dating back to the 19th century where scientists, validated the type of telepathies that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. How would they do that? How do they validate? And the reason I bring this up is because through science, through observation, we turn theories into, proven facts, very similar to the announcement that was just made for Einstein's theory of relativity or gravitational waves that were just discovered and announced last week and actually observed. What kind of experiments did they do to actually validate the types of telepathy?
Well, the type of telepathy that they validated is the first, instinctive-based telepathy. And so all of the experiments on telepathy, the cards and the different kinds of remote viewing experiments and so on are all ways of validating that level of telepathy. Nobody really has been able to do anything on the higher levels of telepathy. These are the subtle levels, and I think that's coming. But for right now, what we have in all of our scientists, past and present, is experiments on this instinctive level.
Very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, Colleen, as you were, I found it interesting as I was reading through your some of your book, how you talk about, and just when you got involved in the magazine and the center, dating back to many, many years ago, and it's kind of interesting to see that these topics were out there. People were practicing this many, many years ago, because it only feels like now this type of, this way of thinking, this understanding, talking about connecting to the soul seems much more, I guess, prevalent now. It's hard to think that these things were happening many years ago too. People were talking about this and practicing it.
Absolutely, but here's what the difference is. In the ancient world, only initiates had access to these teachings, and now it's something that any of us can undertake. It's really up to us if we think we're ready and able to commit to the daily practice that this kind of training requires. Mm-hmm. This knowledge was once taught in the ages mystery schools in Egypt, Greece, Babylon, and India, and it was first put into book form by the Hindu sage Patanjali. He wrote a wonderful book called the Yoga Sutras, which is a classic book. And in that book, he really outlined these steps.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so is there one thing that is recommended that should be done on a daily basis as a part of your daily practice in order to strengthen this connection?
Yeah, it's the meditation that I just talked about. It's the Raja Yoga meditation, where we're extending our attention upward day after day after day. We are building this energetic or subtle bridge between the lower mind and the soul. And the mind then becomes a conduit that transmits information from the soul to the physical brain.
And how long would one need to dedicate to this practice on a daily basis?
I think it's really individual. Here's what happened to me. I've always had thought that making a deeper connection to my soul was something that was for people more evolved than I am. But I was surprised at when I started this, how early on I started to feel a deepening connection to my soul. So it really depends. I mean, it's said that we come into each lifetime at the place where we left off, that we come in with the skills and abilities that we developed in the past. So if we're all walking down the same road, the only difference is that some of us are in different parts of the road. So it's really hard to answer that question. It really depends on the individual.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how do you define the soul?
I define the soul as it's called the causal body in the esoteric teachings. It's the repository of all our many lifetimes of experience. So all the wisdom we've gained lifetime after lifetime is encased in the soul.
Mm-hmm. And what about the higher self? How does that relate to the soul?
I think it's
what is the higher self?
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, just different words.
Okay. And so why is it important? This seems to be a more and more common topic. I noticed, with our show, and also what people are thought leaders out there are starting to talk about, connecting to the soul. We had Panache Desai on months ago, talked about our soul signature. So the soul seems to be a very a more common topic that is on the forefront of spiritual conversation these days. Why is it important to connect with our souls? What happens when we do? What happens when we don't?
I think that's a great question. I think it's so important now because when we make conscious contact with the soul, everything changes. We lose our sense of separateness and realize that we're all one, that we're part of the soul of humanity. and we find our place within the greater whole and experience our interconnection of all life. And you can imagine how the world would change if a critical mass of people made this shift. It's so essential right now. Barbara Marx Hubbard has written that those of us on Earth today are the crossover generation, that we're responsible for leading the way from one stage of our species evolution to the next. Eckhart Tolle talks about this too, but in more stark terms. He says that as a species, we have the choice now to evolve or die. They both say that evolution happens as a result of some sort of crisis that propels or forces us to make a leap forward. Tolle uses the example of an amphibian who's forced to develop the ability to live on land after its habitat dries up. Our own habitat is in trouble, and we're faced with that same need now. Our world is full of conflict. We have weapons that can extinguish the human race. So we need to make that leap, not onto land, but into the subtle worlds. It's an evolutionary step.
Mm-hmm. And I love the quote. In fact, I wrote it down that you had in your book from Albert Einstein that said, the problem in our world cannot be solved by the same level of thinking that created them.
That's right. We can bring in, when we have access to these higher worlds, we can bring in wisdom and knowledge that will make a huge difference in our world. So it's a great service. We do it for our own personal development, but it's a great, great service that we can render for the world.
And I think there was mention too in your book about how there's a lot of practice communicating to, with higher levels of consciousness and different realms out there that also have access to high levels of wisdom, but that we can go within and tap into our own level of wisdom, correct?
Mm-hmm.
For this.
Mm-hmm. The soul has, like I said, the wisdom of our many, many lifetimes, and it's our greatest and most reliable source of direction and guidance. But what's also interesting is that the soul is the portal to the higher worlds. And when we make contact with the soul, we actually can pull in information from the universal or divine mind, which is the great storehouse of all information, past, present, and future. And this is what so many of our people that we call geniuses or visionaries have done.
And Colleen, just hold that thought for one moment. We're going to continue with that when we come back from break in 2 minutes, talking about the soul and the soul's connection to higher levels of wisdom. Inspire living with
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Vibe Nation Radio is brought to you by Carrie Turcotte and Dean Thomas. Each week we bring a refreshing outlook to lifting the veils of illusion that occur in our daily lives. We will share our own learnings and personal experience that allow others to understand who they truly are.
At the end of each show, Carrie will be tapping into the listeners' energies just to give an idea of what to expect for the week ahead. So join us each Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and together we will discover the inner keys that will unlock the true you.
The number one reason girls drop out of school in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of access to feminine hygiene products. The Pads for Schoolgirls Project, an outreach of Humanity Healing International, is changing this paradigm by setting up sewing programs at schools, teaching girls a vocational skill, while producing the reusable pads that help keep them attending classes. The girls pay it forward by making and giving pad kits to other girls in need. To learn more, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is. One planet, 7.3 billion people, only one you. Life offers us many opportunities and learning experiences. Are you ready to explore and discover this beautiful planet, the life and energy all around us, the spiritual world, and what is unseen, along with your own personal soul adventure? Mark Lanehart, the intuitive prospector, is the spiritual connection you have been prospecting for. Internationally known as a tested and professional clairvoyant medium and spiritual advisor, Mark's work as a metaphysical teacher, medical instructor, radio show host, inspirational writer, and hiking guide are here to help you on a journey of self-discovery, healing, inspiration, education, and a whole lot of spiritual awesomeness. Dare to dream. Dare to explore. Dare to live. For more information on Mark's spiritual practice in Seattle, Washington, please visit marklanehart.com or internet search The Intuitive Prospector.
Welcome to The Gathering Around My Kitchen Table on Equilarium FM, Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Join my guests as we integrate spirituality into everyday reality with vibrant conversations, inspired interviews, and my latest channeled guidance to inspire and brighten your day. I'm Claire Johnson, and together we'll be raising vibrations across the nations.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
And welcome back, inspired listeners, to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim on OMTimes Radio, and our special guest today, Colleen Mauro. We're talking about the soul. We're talking about spiritual telepathy. We're talking about all kinds of great things. But first, before we continue on with our conversation here, we want to acknowledge our sponsor, who is sponsoring the second half of this of our show, and it's the Happiness Tour. The Happiness Tour is a movement that's dedicated to spreading the happy across every major city in the U.S. The Happiness Tour first stops in New York City with an evening of inspiration, entertainment, and meaningful connection that'll help spread happiness. Choose happy. Visit happinessroadtour.com to join today. What a great cause. Who doesn't want to be happy? Everybody wants to be happy, and we love what they stand for, and we thank them for their sponsorship and being a part of the inspired community. So, Colleen, before we went to break, you were talking about the soul as a repository of all of our lifetimes, but that it also is connected to universal consciousness and other levels of wisdom as well.
Yeah, this is really fun to research. One of my all-time favorite books was written by the late Willis Harman, who was the former president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It was called Higher Creativity. I think it was written in 1984. And in this book, he looked at the biographies of many artists, writers, composers, scientists, and inventors, and discovered that their greatest achievements came from an intuitive breakthrough. And so I reread the book before I started mine. And then I went to his bibliography and started reading some of his original sources. And that was very interesting. What I discovered when I read the full text of the interviews was that many of the people we call geniuses talked about their creative process in exactly the way it's explained in the wisdom teachings, that it's through the soul that they had access to a universal flow of information and inspiration. One book was especially helpful. It was called Talks with Great Composers, and it was written in the late 1800s by Arthur Abel. He was an American violinist living in Europe. It didn't actually come out until the 50s. I think he had an agreement with Brahms not to publish it until after Brahms' death. But in this book, he interviewed many great composers, Puccini, Brahms, Strauss, and Wagner. And what was so fascinating to me was the consistency of their experience. Each of them spoke of the soul as a portal to a universal source of inspiration, and that once they were connected to the source, the ideas and images they needed for their great achievements simply flowed into their brains. And I have many of these stories in the book. And it became clear to me then that genius is not this rare and random event, but it's an experience that each of us can cultivate. That the key, and Puccini said this very explicitly, the key is our own soul force, making contact with that soul force. And Albert Einstein talked about this too. He made it really clear that his inspiration came from a higher source. But I found it very interesting that after he died, researchers dissected his brain, trying to understand the source or the reason for his brilliance. And the brain is really just the receiver or the receiving plate, not the generator of the experience. So he probably thought that was hilarious. He made it very clear where his inspiration came from with all the quotes that he left us. But it was absolutely fascinating to me to realize that these people were not special or different from us. They just had this ability that any of us can cultivate to make contact with the soul.
I love that explanation, because we think of somebody like Albert Einstein and we think, oh, they were born with a special gift. And I mean, he was quite intelligent, but I don't think people think of Albert Einstein as having been connected to his soul or to all that is, right? And so that's nice to know that everybody has access to this type of wisdom, because I think you're right, Colleen. A lot of people think they've got to go through somebody else to have as the intermediary to access this kind of information, then relay it back to ourselves. And it's so much more empowering to know that, no, we can do this. We can do this at any time for ourselves.
Absolutely. When we train our minds in this way, the mind becomes like our own individual search engine. It can be extended out into the cosmos. It can gather information and then download that information directly into our brains. And when we do this, we actually become the intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. So like I said before, we can actually bring down wisdom and knowledge that can help the world. So it's an incredible thing that we do, not just for our own development, but for our ability to provide service for the world, which is so essential right now.
Oh, it sure is. I mean, we look at all of the world events that are happening around us, and what our part is in this to make the world a better place is a very important one for sure. So, explain for somebody who has never tried to connect to their soul, who may be aware of meditation, may not be practicing it now. These may be concepts that are that they're aware of, but maybe they don't understand what the feeling might be like. So if somebody wanted to connect to their soul, let's just say they had a project that they were working on that they needed inspiration for, or ideas, or not sure what next steps are. What might that process look like for them? And then how do they know from their soul?
Yeah. Well, I think that it happens spontaneously sometimes, the way it did for me in the garden. But what I love about this is that we don't have to wait for it to happen. We can actually train ourselves so that we can get the information at will. And we do this by that daily practice of creating that bridge. But I think people can start just by doing a very simple type of meditation. I have quite a few practices in the book, and including the very basic Raja Yoga meditation. So people can start with that. They start building this bridge, and they can just ask for information and just quiet themselves down and wait to hear.
Very good. And I think that's very helpful for people who may not be familiar with, what it takes to sit in meditation, how it feels to sit in meditation, and all of those good things. So I think the tips and the steps are probably very helpful for people who would like to experience this process. Now, when you talk about, in the book, you say that we are on the brink of an evolutionary leap. One as profound as our emergence from animal to human. That's pretty big. What do you mean by that?
Well, when we make contact with the soul, we are taking our first steps beyond the physical world and into the subtle world. And it's then that we cross the boundary from human to superhuman development, because the subtle world then becomes part of our human world. And this is an evolutionary step. And those of us who do this are really the pioneers who will lead the way from one stage of our species evolution to the next, just like Barbara Marx Hubbard has said, that we're really explorers in the same way that Christopher Columbus and Magellan and other explorers of the physical world were, that we're exploring a new world. It's the subtle world now, not the physical world. But we're blazing a trail and making it easier for those who follow.
And Colleen, one part of the book that I want to read to the inspired listeners out there, you talked about the early point in our history as knowledge of the outer world being paramount to our survival. And now that we know that the world is actually kind of a small place because we're so connected, in the book you talk about in the past 4 centuries, our focus has been on the development of the rational mind. Our educational system has been made possible to develop our rational minds to the very peak of their power. But as many spiritual leaders tell us, our next evolutionary frontier is the consciousness use of an even higher mental faculty, or a purely intuitive means of accessing information. We are hovering on the borders of new knowledge, and it is our privilege to be the pioneers. I found that paragraph in your book to be very insightful. And as you and Kim were talking, you were talking about Albert Einstein.
Mm-hmm.
And with the announcement that came out last week with his gravitational waves, they're calling that the announcement of the century, because this is something that he predicted back in 1914. Over 100 years ago, that thought or that intuitiveness of knowing was just a theory up until last week, when they actually discovered it in September, but they just released the information last week as an official announcement and official recordings. And so that's kind of going in line with exactly what the book is saying, is that we're on the borders of this new knowledge, meditation, understanding the higher consciousness, connecting that bridge that you talked about. I'm just curious, how do you get into your daily meditation of doing this? Because, it's some people say easier said than done. They're so distracted. We have so many distractions in life. What are some simple techniques to actually just getting into the meditation and actually getting the mind to settle down and become quiet so they can start to have this intuition that you're talking about?
Well, that's a really good question. There's actually a preliminary step in this type of esoteric training, and it's called the refinement of our physical, emotional, and mental bodies. And I devoted an entire chapter to it. It's so important. And what we need to do is create a direct line of communication between the soul, the mind, and the brain. And to do this, we need to purify the physical body and quiet our minds and emotions. If we're ill, if we're tired, if we have mental or emotional static, it will be difficult for our brains to actually register the higher wisdom and ideas, especially when our emotional body is out of whack and we're upset about something or obsessing about something. It actually repels the subtle levels of current. And what I discovered is that refinement practices are part of all of our spiritual traditions. And even though the methods vary, the requirements and goals are exactly the same. Purity of body, control of the emotions, and stability of mind. And in the book, I included the refinement practices that have helped me the most. One's called harmlessness. That's where we just monitor our thoughts and our speech and our deeds. The other is called the nightly review, where we just take stock of our day by day. And also meditations that help me be more forgiving and more loving. I have meditations on loving kindness, forgiveness, and compassion. And all these things quieted me down day after day. I had a lot of trouble with all the emotional turmoil that I discovered was sort of lodged, down there. When you try to quiet the mind, anything unresolved starts to bubble up. Mm-hmm. And I had people that I needed to forgive. Yeah,
so forgiveness, gratitude, big, powerful words for getting into that space. Mm-hmm. So with that, we're to our last break in the show. We're going to be back in 2 minutes. We have Colleen Mauro talking about spiritual telepathy and accessing the higher access and portals of the mind. So stay tuned. We'll be back on Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio.
Connecting you with the best of the conscious minds in the world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Come heal yourself. What is healing? Healing is nothing but connecting with your all-knowing higher self that already has solutions to all your problems and is always there to guide you. Through this show, we help you to connect with that you are and tap into that innate potential you have to transform your life and fly high. Please join me, your host Monica Goyal, every Sunday, 7 p.m. Pacific. Namaste.
Looking for inspiration?
Want to be inspired?
Not sure where to go?
Find Mark and Kim every Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern on Inspired Living.
Topics will elevate consciousness and range from metaphysics to the human and social experience and all things spiritual.
Welcome to an inspired community that offers support, encouragement, and new ways of thinking. You are the inspired and the inspiration.
Simone Milasas would like you to know that business can be fun, which is why she wrote the book, Joy of Business. What if you could have the joy of business rather than the stress and struggle? Most of the time, the only thing stopping you from a thriving business is you. In the Joy of Business book, Simone gives you access consciousness tools and pragmatic ways to get out of your own way and to create the business, life, and living you know is possible and beyond what this reality says is achievable. Business is joy. It's creation. It's generative. It can be the adventure of living. You can purchase your copy of the book through Amazon or Joy of Business website, www.accessjoyofbusiness.com.
Have you bought into the idea that you have to work hard for your money, that business is hard? I will share some dynamic access consciousness tools to get you out of your own way so you can create a business that actually succeeds. Join me, Simone Millisers, on The Joy of Business at 4 p.m. Mondays Eastern.
Your conscious connection to a more mindful world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
And welcome back to Inspired Living with Mark and Kim here on OMTimes Radio, or what we like to call Wisdom Wednesday. And we've got a lot of wisdom going on right now. So before the break, Colleen, we were talking about getting into the routine of meditation and how some folks have a hard time actually doing that. Can you just kind of give your story as far as being more regular in your meditation and how you accomplish this?
Absolutely. I had a hard time with it, and I wanted to be honest about that in the book because I figured if it was hard for me, it's probably hard for a lot of people. It's always best to do this first thing in the morning before you're caught up in the activities of the day, because once you start thinking about your day and what you have to do, your brain starts to get into gear, and that makes it much harder to quiet yourself down enough to meditate. And I'm not a morning person by any stretch of the imagination, and I never have been. I'm somebody who likes to wake up slowly and sort of gently ease into the day. And for most of my adult life, I was involved in magazine publishing, and I was always on deadline. I had to jump out of bed as soon as the alarm went off. And while I worked on this book, I finally had this extended period where I could honor my own rhythms. And I didn't want to get out of bed and start training my mind as soon as I opened my eyes. I wanted to enjoy this rare experience of this leisurely, quiet morning. So I tried all kinds of things to avoid having to jump out of bed and meditate. I would give myself an hour in the morning, and I'd read and drink tea and really enjoy my morning. And the problem was that this leisurely morning gave me too much time to think about the day ahead. And when I finally got around to meditating, I struggled and was very frustrated. And so I had to find a balance between what I needed to do and what I wanted to do. And I think that that's something that we all have to do. It's sort of a balance between honoring ourselves and being too self-indulgent. What I do is, because I don't want to get up as soon as I open my eyes and start mind training, I give myself about 20 minutes to stay in bed and read. I read the paper. I'm sure I get thrown out of any ashram in the world. But it works for me because it allows me to wake up slowly, and then before I do anything else, I immediately meditate. And that has allowed me to be consistent. And consistency is really the key because, like I said, what we're doing is we're building a very subtle, very energetic bridge. And if we stop, even for a few days, it starts to dissipate. That it's the daily experience of it, projecting our attention upward day after day after day that starts to make that connection for us. And it's actually a pretty short meditation. It's 10 to 15 minutes in the beginning, and it never goes over 20 minutes. When we do this kind of meditation, we're pulling down the higher, finer vibrations from the subtle worlds, and that's very energizing for the brain. And if we do it any longer, it can make it hard to sleep because your brain gets overamped. And I've had this experience a few times where I just went overboard, and I did have a hard time sleeping, so it's not recommended. So really, it's not much of a time commitment, and the rewards are great. When I started to tap into these levels, I felt this kind of joy that I've never felt before. Your heart starts to open. You feel like a bigger and better person, and you realize that you are a bigger and better person, that your vibration starts to pick up and your spiritual development starts to pick up. Everything starts to move faster.
Yeah,
well,
there's a sense of peace. No, I was just going to say there's a sense of peace that goes along with that as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of the studies that I've researched on meditation is a lot of the great spiritual teachers and meditation masters, again, daily discipline, being consistent with the practice, but a lot of them get up in the very early morning of the hours between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. because they find that that's when everything is the most still, and they actually set their meditational practices. Now, not everybody's going to get up at 2 a.m. to meditate, But I agree with you on the whole morning practice of getting into a place of stillness, quietness, connected, peaceful.
Right. We have to do what works for us, what allows us to be consistent. I know from my own experience that if I force myself to do something I don't want to do, like getting up at 2 or whatever it is, I'll do it for about 2 weeks and then I'll rebel. So I've learned over the years that I have to sort of make this deal with myself that does take in my own needs into consideration. So I found what works for me, and other people just have to kind of find that balance.
Well, and I think what you said too earlier, I think some people have this notion that they've got to spend hours in meditation, and the fact that, you're saying that 15 to 20 minutes is really all that you need. I mean, that seems a lot more doable, I think, to most people, and not maybe so cumbersome.
Absolutely. And in the beginning, it's 10 to 15 minutes. That's fine. Yeah. So in the book, there's 12 meditations and 2 additional practices. I wanted this to be very how-to. A lot of this esoteric information is often presented just in theory. I wanted this to be, number one, easy to read, and I wanted it to be very how-to so anybody could pick it up and start following these practices. So there's three sort of mind training practices that build one upon the other. The first one is in chapter 6, which is about building the bridge. And I recommend that people do that for at least 6 months before they move on to the more advanced meditations.
And when you say advanced meditations, would that be a meditation that would be longer in length than the 15 to 20 minutes?
Not necessarily. It's about the same amount of time. But what we're working on first is just quieting the mind and starting to build that bridge. And when we build that bridge, then we can sort of ask for information. We can formulate a question and then send it up to the soul and listen. But it takes some preliminary work to really quiet ourselves down enough where we can do that and really get a clear answer.
So, Colleen, you talk a lot about being able to access wisdom, and that that wisdom can help inspire creativity and things like that, make us feel a part of the whole rather than kind of in our own individual silos. What do you say about like living in alignment with your soul? How might that be a different way of understanding your soul?
Well, that's really the ultimate goal, is to be what we call soul aligned. And the ultimate model for that is Jesus Christ. He was the model for what a soul aligned person is. And he modeled the soul qualities of forgiveness, of unconditional love. And that's what we're working towards as we build that bridge day after day after day. Hello?
Oh, looks like Kim has dropped off there. So, along with Jesus Christ, are there other historical figures that have done same things? Like Buddha, Muhammad, Gandhi. Did they all follow the same path as well?
Absolutely, and Gandhi's a great example because he used what he called soul force to do his work. I mean, he sort of created that nonviolent resistance movement, and so he was a great example of somebody who led through soul force. Yeah,
and when you and Kim were talking, I was just thinking too. The spiritual teachers talk about people say it's an excuse of they can't meditate because they don't have enough time. There's the saying, if you can't spend 15 minutes in meditation, then you should spend an hour in meditation. So, but it's building up to something, with a daily discipline and consistency to do it. And for me, just even doing the work today that I'm doing, and even talking to you here on the radio show, all started with the power of meditation and that higher consciousness. So, Colleen, do you have any events coming up, any book signings, and where can the listeners buy your book and visit you in person?
It's available on Amazon, and my website, again, is spiritualtelepathy.net. People can go there and read the introduction to the book. They can look at back issues of Intuition magazine, and there's many links then to buying the book. There's also a list of interviews that I have coming up. I'm going to be doing some things in San Francisco in June. They're not quite firmed up yet, but otherwise I'm going to be doing radio mostly.
Okay, mostly radio. And you live in the San Francisco area, yes?
No, I used to. Now I'm living in Minneapolis.
Oh, you're in Minneapolis. Okay, so you're in the Midwest. Okay. Yeah, just in case folks, sometimes we get questions on where you're located. So just doing radio, just talking about spiritual telepathy. Any new books that you're working on, or anything that you want to give some insight to the listeners that they can, look forward to? More work from you?
Yeah, it's not going to be books, though. I'm more interested in doing some online and film work, so that's going to be the next thing.
Okay. And has any of the techniques in the book been turned into like CDs that they could actually do as far as meditations or anything like that?
Not yet, but I'm hoping for the future.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know why I said that, so maybe that's just a validation for you to get those techniques turned into CDs so people can start accessing that. Well, Colleen, it's been a pleasure having you here on Inspired Living. Unfortunately, we did lose Kim with the connection. Like I told you before the show, full moon cycle. I wasn't kidding. So, but we wanted just to thank you for being on Inspired Living Radio, and I know our Inspired listeners really get a lot out of doing this. And one of the things that I always like to ask guests is what is the biggest takeaway from spiritual telepathy? We got about 2 minutes here, but if you could really just give a quick, elevator pitch on why spiritual telepathy is so important for the listening audience, what would that be?
Well, it's really changed my life. And what I would say is that it's not much of a time commitment. And what I experience, as I said, is so much more peace and joy in my life, a more consistent source of guidance. And I have a much greater understanding of the contribution that I can make to the world. And for me, there's really no greater joy than that. So it's worth the small investment in time.
I love that. That's beautiful. So, again, one more time for the listening audience, where can they find you out on the
spiritualtelepathy.net.
Spiritualtelepathy.net. And check out her book. It is a great book. And, Colleen, I'd like to have you back on Inspired Living maybe later in the year or in 2017. But thank you so much for being a guest this week. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you.
So next week's guest is Gordon Asher Davidson. We're going to be talking about the transfiguration of our world and how the Light Alliance is transforming darkness and creating a new earth. It sounds very interesting. So until then, be kind, be caring, be compassionate. Namaste.